Evelyn was 70 years old and had a serene heart. She had spent much of her life saving to buy her little beach house, a simple place but full of memories of her husband and of family summers. When her son and daughter-in-law decided to spend a few days there, she was filled with joy until the moment when, between laughter and disdain, her daughter-in-law told her to leave so as not to disturb the guests. Half an hour later, as she walked alone along the cold sand, something unexpected completely changed the course of her story. You know, sometimes it is exactly when we think life has calmed down that the ground decides to open up. My name is Evelyn. I am 70 years old and my heart is full of memories. I lived a life of simplicity and dignity beside a man who taught me the value of words and faith. After he passed away, I was left with our beach house in Charleston, a place that felt sacred. It was there I heard the sound of the waves and felt that he was still with me. That house was more than an inheritance, it was a piece of our story. A home where truth lived side by side with longing. I remember spending the afternoon sitting on the porch, listening to the sound of the sea. It is curious how the sound of waves can soothe and make you think at the same time. Sometimes the wind carried memories of old laughter, other times it brought the heavy silence of solitude. But I never complained. When you have faith, even emptiness becomes space for God to act. I believed that that house, that little paradise, was his way of telling me, you are not alone yet. It was one ordinary afternoon when the phone rang. On the other end, my son's voice, Thomas. Mom, we are coming for the weekend, me, Olivia, and some friends. You don't mind, do you? He asked with that quick, almost automatic tone. My heart filled with joy. Of course not, my son. It will be a blessing, I replied. And in that moment, without knowing it, I began to prepare not only the house but my heart. I spent the day cleaning every corner, changing sheets, buying fresh fruit, and baking the lemon cake he used to love as a child. I remember that as I mixed the batter, I thought, love is this doing your best for those you love, even if you don't know whether they will appreciate it. No task is small when done with care. And I hoped that meeting would bring back the sparkle in my son's eyes. That night, before bed, I sat on the porch and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed closer, as if whispering something. I felt a light shiver, that kind of feeling only a mother's heart understands. The wind was different, colder, quieter. Something told me that visit would not be like the others. But out of faith or stubbornness, I chose to believe that God was just preparing a new beginning. The next morning I woke early, before sunrise. The sea air has a smell that mixes salt and memory, and that day seemed to promise joy. I made coffee, fried cheese bread, and set the table with the cups I saved for special occasions. A mother's heart is like that, it rejoices in anticipation. When I heard the sound of the car approaching, I felt an old, almost childlike excitement. It was the sound of my boy coming home. Thomas came in first, tall, serious, with his phone glued to his hand. Olivia followed right behind, elegant, with that look that measures everything before smiling. Mom, he said, hugging me quickly, like someone eager to finish a duty. But even so, that touch made my day. I'm so glad you came, I said. She looked around and said, what a charming house, but it smells kind of old, doesn't it? I smiled. It's the scent of history, dear. The scent of love that lasts. She didn't answer, just fixed her hair and looked away. As I showed them around the house, I noticed Thomas seemed distant. He hardly looked at me. He talked about business, investments, travels. And there I was, trying to fit my voice between his rushed sentences. A mother knows when her child is absent, even when physically present. I missed that boyish laughter, the honest look he had as a child. But time sometimes steals more than years. It steals people's hearts when they forget where they came from. During lunch, I tried to bring back some joy. I made his favorite dish, told old stories, talked about his father. But it seemed like he no longer remembered. Olivia watched everything with a half smile, the kind that isn't joy but superiority. Even so, I served dessert calmly, telling myself, dignity is never lost, even when respect is. Sometimes strength is in continuing to smile when the world ignores you. That night, while they rested, I sat alone on the porch. The wind moved the curtains, and I thought about how love can turn into silence. There is a kind of silence that comforts and another that hurts. What I felt that night was the latter. And inside me, a soft voice said, do not fear, Evelyn. All this has a purpose. I didn't know what it was, but I trusted. Because when you have faith, doubt becomes a bridge, not an abyss. And there, under the moonlight, I said a short prayer, one of those that doesn't ask, only thanks. Lord, if something needs to change, give me courage. If something will hurt, give me faith. And if something will be lost, let it be to teach me. Little did I know that prayer would be answered much sooner than I imagined. The next day, I woke early to prepare breakfast. When I reached the living room, loud music filled the air. Laughter, voices, open suitcases. I was surprised. There were people I had never seen before, Olivia's friends, scattered around the house as if it were a resort. She saw me and said in a sweet but impatient tone, "Oh, Evelyn, we are going to need the house just for ourselves this weekend, okay?" For a moment, I thought it was a joke. But her look was serious, as cold as the wind blowing through the windows. I took a deep breath. "But this is my house, dear," I replied calmly. She sighed. "Thomas thinks it's best if you go back to the city for a few days. It'll be crowded here." Thomas, my son. The same one I carried in my arms, the same one who slept on my chest when he had a fever. He just lowered his head, unable to look me in the eye. His silence was the hardest blow. Sometimes silence is crueler than lies because it doesn't explain, it just hurts. I grabbed my purse and a shawl. I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I walked to the door with the dignity I had left. Outside, the wind was biting and the sound of the waves seemed to mock me. Each step in the sand was a farewell. I felt a mix of anger and compassion, of loss and faith. Because deep down, a mother always believes that God is watching. And if he sees, justice may take time, but it never fails. I sat on a bench near the pier, looking at the rough sea. Memories came in waves, my husband laughing, Thomas fishing with me as a child, the smell of coffee on Sunday mornings. Everything that was once love now seemed distant, swallowed by an abyss of ingratitude. But even there, alone, I felt that forgiveness would be stronger than bitterness. Faith, more powerful than pride. As I watched the seagulls flying over the sea, I thought maybe this is what God does. He takes us away from those who don't value us to bring us closer to him. It was a thought both bitter and beautiful. And in that moment, I realized that silence can be a form of prayer. The wind was still strong, but something inside me was beginning to calm. Maybe it was courage being born. Maybe it was God drawing near. And it was at that exact point, between pain and serenity, that the unexpected began to unfold. A fisherman approached, dragging a net. "Evelyn?" he asked. It was Henry, a longtime friend of my husband. The kind of man whose eyes have seen many tides rise and fall, yet never lost faith. "Are you all right?" he asked, genuinely concerned. I told him everything. The visit, the daughter-in-law, the son, the silence. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he simply said, "God has strange ways of giving back what's yours." And he smiled. A simple smile, but full of truth. Those words stayed with me as I walked back home. The sun was starting to set, and the air felt lighter. Half an hour later, I saw 2 cars parked at the gate. Men in suits, folders in hand. My heart began to race. "What's going on?" I asked as I approached. Thomas and Olivia stood on the porch, confused. One of the men looked at me and asked, "Are you Mrs. Evelyn Harper?" I nodded, still unsure. "I'm your late husband's lawyer. We have an urgent matter." He opened his folder and began to explain. "There's been a recent update to the will. Your husband added a clause stating that this house must remain solely in your name. Any unauthorized use constitutes trespassing." I stood still, in disbelief. Thomas turned pale. Olivia was speechless. God had spoken, and no one could question it. It was as if the sea itself had returned what was mine. I felt a mix of relief and reverence. Time stopped. The sound of the waves felt like applause from heaven. God, in his silent justice, had acted without me lifting a finger. Sometimes miracles don't come when we ask, they come when we stop fighting alone. And there, before everyone, I realized that faith and patience are the weapons of those who trust in truth. The lawyer looked at me and smiled. "Your husband seemed to foresee this might happen." At that moment, a tear fell, not of sadness, but gratitude. I felt as if he were still there, defending me from the other side of eternity. That wasn't just justice, it was love continuing the work that death couldn't interrupt. And as I walked back into my home, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The scent of lemon cake was still in the air. It was as if God was saying, "See, what's yours can't be taken. Just wait for me to act." But what happened next was even more surprising. When I picked up my purse and left my own house, silence spoke for me. Each step was a silent prayer, a plea for God to give me courage. I remember the sound of the sand under my feet and the wind on my face, cold, almost cutting. That was when I realized there are moments when love cannot protect us. It must let us suffer so the heart can learn to listen again. Dignity, my dear, is the last coat we wear when respect is taken from us. I got into the car with trembling hands. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw my son on the porch, his head down. He said nothing, and perhaps that was what hurt the most. The betrayal of a stranger can be forgotten. But when it comes from your child, it is as if time itself stops to watch. I remember whispering, Lord, if all that remains is silence, let it at least teach me. It was a simple prayer, but full of faith. I drove without direction. I passed the seaside road where we used to walk together. Every curve brought a memory, every memory a pang of longing. I remembered a time many years ago when Thomas was little and said, Mom, one day I will take care of you. How curious destiny is, isn't it? Sometimes the one who promised to protect us is the one who ends up hurting us. And even so, a mother's heart insists on forgiving before being asked. I parked near an old wooden church, one of those that smell of candles and the sea. I entered slowly, sat in the last pew, and looked at the altar. The priest wasn't there, only the crucifix and silence. And in that moment I cried not from anger, but from exhaustion. Faith is a curious thing. When everything collapses, it's what holds the pieces together. I prayed with a bare heart. I only asked to understand why. While I prayed, I remembered my husband. He used to say, Evelyn, God delays, but he's never late, and I smiled through the tears. The truth is, hope is stubborn. It refuses to die, even when the world pushes us away. And deep down, I felt something moving, even if invisible. A silent promise, yet to be fulfilled. When I left the church, the sky was opening in golden tones. The wind wasn't as cold anymore. I took the road back not knowing where to go, but with my heart a little lighter. It's funny, when the soul lets go of control, God starts to drive. Back at the beach, I parked near the pier and stayed there, watching the seagulls. They seemed so free, so sure of their path, and there I was, feeling lost in the middle of what I once called home. The sound of waves crashing on the rocks reminded me that everything in life has its tides. Sometimes it rises and drowns us, other times it retreats and reveals treasures. And maybe faith is just that, continuing to breathe, even when the wave seems too big. I took an old notebook I always kept in the car and began to write. It was a habit I learned when young, to write so I wouldn't get sick. Today I was expelled from my own home, I wrote. Just by writing, the words began to heal me. But I haven't lost my faith, I added. Because when pride dies, hope is reborn. And there, in those crooked lines, I felt something inside me realigning. A young man walked by selling flowers. I bought one. A single flower, red, alive, strong. I placed it beside me and thought, may the love I gave one day return to me multiplied. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning. Faith, when it's true, fits even in the smallest acts. And at that moment, I realized the heart doesn't need a home, just a purpose to keep beating. Later, an older man approached, a face that felt familiar. It was Henry, the old fisherman, my husband's friend. Evelyn? He asked, in his raspy voice. Everything all right? And as if he were an angel in disguise, I broke down. I told him everything. He listened patiently, only nodding. When I finished, he looked at me and said, Don't worry, Evelyn. God has strange ways of giving back what's yours. Those words entered me like a seed planted in the desert. Strange ways of giving back what's yours. That thought wouldn't leave my mind. It was as if heaven had sent me a message through a fisherman. I returned to the car in silence, my heart divided between fear and hope. And as soon as I sat behind the wheel, I saw two official cars turning the corner, stopping right in front of my house. The sound of the doors slamming echoed in the air, and my heart started racing. Something was about to happen. Something big. I got out of the car slowly, not understanding anything. Thomas and Olivia were outside, looking startled. Two men in suits were speaking to them, holding folders and papers. My mother's instinct wanted to run to my son, but something held me back. The lawyer turned to me and asked, Are you Mrs. Evelyn Harper? I nodded. I am your late husband's attorney, ma'am. I have an important update regarding his will. My whole body shivered. I could barely breathe. He calmly explained that before passing away, my husband had added an amendment to his will. This document stated that the beach house was exclusively mine, and that any unauthorized use would constitute trespassing. I stood still, silent. I didn't cry, didn't smile. I only felt the weight of divine justice falling, light and precise. When God acts, he doesn't need to raise his voice. He simply reveals the truth, and the world falls silent. Thomas looked at me, pale as paper. Olivia tried to justify herself, stammering, We didn't know. It was a misunderstanding, but nothing she said could change the fact. The lawyer was firm. By court order, I asked that you vacate the property until further notice. And at that moment, something that seemed lost was restored. I didn't need to fight or shout. Faith was enough. The miracle came at the right time, 30 minutes after my expulsion. I entered the house slowly, feeling the floor as if for the first time. The smell of the sea, the sound of the waves, the echo of my husband's memory. Everything was the same, but I was different. Sometimes the miracle isn't what God changes around us, it's what He transforms within us. And there between pain and relief, I felt my strength begin to bloom again. Olivia approached, trying to justify herself with tears that did not seem sincere. Thomas, on the other hand, said nothing. He just looked down, overcome with shame. I took a deep breath and said calmly, "This house was built with love, and love does not go with disrespect." The words came out soft but firm and echoed like a verdict. Faith gave me a voice when pain tried to silence me. While the lawyer gathered the papers, I looked at the sea and thought, God does not tarry. He prepares. I had lost my home for a few hours, but I gained something much greater, the certainty that His justice never fails, even when it takes time. And what came next was even more divine. After everyone left, silence returned to the house. A different silence, not of pain but of peace. I made a cup of tea and served the lawyer, who was still in the living room, reviewing documents. He looked at me and said, "You know, Mrs. Evelyn, your husband seemed to foresee that you would need this protection one day." I smiled with teary eyes. He always took care of me, even when he was no longer here. And for the first time in a long while, I felt gratitude for everything, even the tears. While we drank the tea, he told me that the will had been updated only weeks before my husband's death. He said that I was the heart of this house and that everything they had built together should remain a home of faith and respect. His words washed over me like a gentle wave. God's justice sometimes comes through the hands of those we least expect. When the lawyer said goodbye, I sat alone on the porch. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky orange. The sea reflected that golden glow, and the wind this time was gentle. I closed my eyes and felt my husband's presence there, as if he whispered, "You won, Evelyn. And you won the right way with faith, not anger." Thomas reappeared on the sidewalk, hesitant. His eyes were red, his face worn. "Mom, may I come in?" His voice trembled. My heart, despite being wounded, was still a home. "Come in, my son," I answered. He cried, embracing me, and in that embrace the pain began to dissolve. Forgiveness born of love is the most beautiful strength there is. I did not need to say much. I simply ran my hand through his hair as when he was small and murmured, "Life teaches my son, and when God wants to restore, no one prevents it." It was a moment of reconciliation, the kind of miracle only someone who forgives can feel. But there was still something to be resolved, something that time and faith were about to reveal. When the lawyer left, the house remained in a strange silence, the kind that precedes dawn after a storm. I sat in my husband's armchair and let my gaze wander across the room. Everything seemed the same, but the air had changed. It felt lighter, fairer. God had cleansed that space with His own hands, and I felt something I had not felt for a long time: peace. Peace of someone humiliated, but who had not lost dignity. Thomas was still there, leaning against the wall, motionless. His eyes were teary. I watched him for a few seconds, that boy who once promised to take care of me, and now seemed to beg permission to exist. "Mother, forgive me," he whispered. Ah, forgiveness, so easy to say, so hard to live. I took a deep breath, stood slowly and said, "Forgiveness is not a gift, my son. It is a process." He cried, and I let him cry. Sometimes the silence between mother and child heals more than 1,000 words. As he sobbed, I remembered a story I heard as a child, a woman who lost everything except faith. And it was that faith that made her rebuild the impossible. I looked at Thomas and realized that life does this to us. It breaks us to teach the value of starting over. It is not what you did that will define you, son. It is what you will do after this. Those words came from me without rehearsal, as if dictated from above. We sat there, the two of us, in silence. I watched the sea through the window. He watched the floor. Time seemed suspended, and the sound of the waves was the soundtrack to that silent reconciliation. The pain still existed, but no longer burned. Now it warmed like a sun after the rain. There are pains that exist only to open space for faith to bloom. Thomas lifted his face and said with a choked voice, "I let myself be carried away. Mother, I wanted to please others and forgot what mattered." I listened calmly. A mother's love is strange. The more it is betrayed, the more it wants to heal. Learn from this, my son. God does not shame us with punishment. He exposes us to fix us. He nodded, and in that exchanged glance without words I felt something being restored. But life still had more lessons to teach. In the days that followed, the house seemed to breathe again. The sound of the waves returned to comfort, and the smell of morning coffee reminded me of when everything was simple. Thomas stayed with me without hurry. He helped with chores, tried to fix small things as if each gesture were a plea for forgiveness, and I in silence let him. True forgiveness is not a spoken word, it is a space we open for the other to try again. One day, while he was painting the windows, he stopped and said, "You know, Mother, I never understood what strength was until I saw you quiet that day." That touched me deeply. True strength is not shouting justice, it is waiting God's timing without being corrupted. I simply replied, "Son, courage is not the absence of fear. It is standing firm even while trembling." He smiled with teary eyes. Faith begins like that, when shame gives way to humility. Olivia, on the other hand, did not return, and I did not wish her ill. Her silence was the way God chose to return my peace. Sometimes the punishment is not losing what one wants, but seeing what was lost grow in those who remained. And I knew that sooner or later she would understand the value of respect, because truth always returns even if in silence. One afternoon, Henry appeared at the gate with a basket of fresh fish and that gentle smile. "See, Evelyn, I told you God has strange ways of giving back what is yours." We laughed together. He seemed happy to see the house alive again. "God does return," I answered, "but sometimes he returns with a lesson for us to learn." And he laughed, shaking his head. The wisdom of the simple always charmed me. At night I sat on the porch with Thomas. The sky was clear and the sea seemed calmer. "Do you think Father would be proud of us?" he asked. "He would," I replied, "because he believed faith is the cement of family. And we are rebuilding ours." The silence that followed was beautiful, the kind of silence that holds gratitude. In that moment I realized the home is not made of walls but of reconciliation. And when forgiveness enters through the door, even the wind changes its sound. One morning, while tidying the bedroom, I found an old box in the closet. Inside were my husband's letters, handwritten yellowing with the scent of old paper and sea. In one of them he wrote, "If one day I am no longer here, remember that the love we built is the shield against any loneliness." I read those words slowly with teary eyes. It was as if he still took care of me. And I understood his faith had left a map so I would not get lost. I showed the letters to Thomas and he fell silent reading one of them. "He was really a man of God, wasn't he, Mother?" "He was," I answered. "And that is what kept him strong until the end." He looked at me tenderly and said, "Now I understand why you are the way you are. Father's faith lives in you." That moved me. The truth is, example is the most valuable inheritance a father can leave, and in that moment I felt the circle closing. We decided to paint the house together. Each brushstroke was a memory, a forgiveness, a prayer. We laughed and sang old songs. It seemed life had returned to its place. Sometimes one must lose the ground to relearn how to walk. And I, who thought I had lost everything, realized I still had the essential, the love that survived the pain. During a break, Thomas said, "Mother, I want to ask you something. Teach me to pray." I smiled. "Praying is simple, my son. It is talking to God like one talks to a friend." There by the sea we prayed together. It was a short prayer, but full of truth. God's presence was so tangible even the winds seemed to pause to listen. After that, the house's atmosphere changed completely. Laughter returned, respect made itself present. Even the pictures on the walls seemed more alive. Forgiveness has that power, it renews the air. Justice heals what pride destroys. And in that new routine, I realized what seemed like the end had been only the beginning of a more beautiful story. But God still had another way to show his care, and it came through a simple gesture from the sea. It was late afternoon when I heard a familiar whistle at the gate. It was Henry again with a bronzed face and a smile of someone bearing good news. "Evelyn, I brought fresh fish for you and your son," he said, lifting the basket. I went to meet him and hugged him. "You never forget us, do you, Henry?" He laughed. "I told you, woman, God returns what is yours, and sometimes he returns it even better." We laughed together. That simplicity moved me. Henry told me the village fishermen had talked about what happened, and that many had been inspired by my story. They said you are proof that faith performs miracles. I was speechless. Sometimes the most powerful testimony is born from the deepest pain. God takes what shames us and turns it into strength for others. Thomas came to the porch, helped carry the basket, and the two began to talk. It was beautiful to see them there laughing together, sharing stories. True reconciliation is quiet. It does not make noise, but it changes the atmosphere. I watched the two and my heart filled with gratitude. Hope, when fed by love, blooms even from ashes. After dinner, I sat alone on the porch. The sea was calm, reflecting the moonlight. I closed my eyes and thanked God. "Thank you, Lord, for returning what I lost and for teaching me that the greatest victory is not hardening the heart." Faith is not a shield against pain, it is a compass to cross it. And there on the gentle sway of the wind I felt the worst had passed. Suddenly a memory came to me, my husband's voice saying, "Have courage, Evelyn, because God always prepares what man destroys." I smiled. He was right. And I realized the true miracle was not the will, not the lawyer, not the house. The true miracle was a son's heart restored. Some weeks later, Olivia sent a new letter. This time she did not ask for forgiveness, she thanked me. She said she had started a theology course and now understood what humility and forgiveness meant. "Today, Evelyn, I pray every day to become a woman of faith like you," she wrote. I smiled reading that. Life has a sweet way of returning lessons when the soul learns without anger. It was proof that God closes wounds with tenderness. I showed the letter to Thomas. He read it and said, "You know, Mother, I think now I can finally breathe." I replied, "It is the clean air of divine justice, my son. When we forgive, God returns the breath." He hugged me tightly, and for the first time I felt that hug was not of repentance but of gratitude. All that hurt now served to teach us to her, and to all who watched from outside and learned from what they saw. One night while we had dinner, Thomas looked at me and said, "You know, Mother, when you left the house that day, I thought it was the end. But it was the beginning." I answered, "That is how God works, son. He creates endings to start new beginnings in disguise." We laughed together, and the sound of our laughter echoed through the house like a blessing. Later, I sat alone on the porch, looking at the sea. The moon reflected on the water like a mirror, and I felt my husband there not as longing but as presence. God, thank you. What the world took from me, you returned with double the love. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The peace I felt was not of this world. From inside the house I heard Thomas humming, and that sound was the final miracle. The home had life again, music and faith. I smiled and murmured, "Thank you, Lord, for returning not only the house but my son's heart." And what happened the next day at the most beautiful sunset I have ever seen was proof that God's miracles never come alone. The following days were full of movement and purpose. Thomas and I spent mornings tending the garden and afternoons restoring the old pier. The sound of hammering mixed with laughter and the noise of the waves. It was curious. Each physical repair seemed to also mend an emotional peace. "Mother, it seems the house is smiling," he said one day with a sparkle in his eyes. I answered, "It smiles because it has love again inside it." A home, after all, always reflects the heart of those who inhabit it. The neighbors began to appear again. "Evelyn, we heard everything, and what a beautiful story," they said. Some brought cakes, others flowers. And I noticed something new. My story was inspiring other people. One of them, Mrs. Helen, told me through tears, "Hearing what you went through made me have the courage to go back to my daughter." And it was then I understood the suffering, when crossed with faith, becomes a bridge for other new beginnings. One afternoon Thomas arrived with an excited idea. "Mother, what if we open the pier to the public on weekends? We could serve coffee, tell stories, teach children to fish." I thought it brilliant. "That would be lovely, my son. A place where people feel peace." And so we began. We put wooden benches, simple lights, and a small handmade sign, Harper Refuge. The name seemed to whisper gratitude to the wind. The first opening day was magical. Families came. Children played. Henry played the accordion, and the house that once was a stage of pain became a beacon of hope. I remember a young man telling me, "Mrs. Evelyn, this house has good energy. It seems God lives here." I smiled. "He does live here, my son. He is in every laugh, in every forgiveness that happens on this ground." What was once a wound was now a testimony. At night I sat on the porch and looked at the lit pier. The sea reflected the lights and seemed to dance. Thomas approached with a cup of tea. "Have you noticed? The sound of the sea seems different now." I laughed. "No, son. The sea is the same. We have changed." That phrase echoed in me like a verse time wanted to write. But little did we know that destiny still held a surprise. One of those that only God can plan with divine precision. The next morning Henry arrived earlier than usual with his crooked hat and a smile. "Evelyn, guess what I discovered?" he said, almost breathless. "Remember the old lighthouse house at the end of the beach? The owner wants to sell it and is offering a symbolic price to someone with purpose for the space." Thomas widened his eyes. "We could turn it into shelter for those in need, Mother." My heart raced. That idea felt like a calling. Without thinking twice, we went to see the place. The house was worn, but the sea around it was unbelievably beautiful. I walked through the rooms and felt the same shiver I felt when I first saw my old house. "This is it," I murmured. "God wants this place used for something greater." Thomas smiled, moved. "Then let's do it together." a home of hope for those who lost everything. Thus was born the second miracle, transforming pain into service. With the fishermen from the village's help, we began restoring the abandoned lighthouse. Every painted wall was an act of faith. People came voluntarily, donated time, food, materials. And I thought kindness is contagious when we light a candle, others light on their own. The strength of that community reminded me that when love organizes, God's justice multiplies. In a few weeks, the place was ready. A simple shelter but full of dignity. We named the space Casa Esperanza. Their families found rest. Fishermen received meals. And village youth came to hear stories of faith, courage, and new beginnings. Thomas, always by my side, said, "Mother, this was the best inheritance Father could have left the example." I agreed. And the most eternal one? Love. At the first service we held there, the sky seemed bluer and the wind lighter. I told the people, God never wastes pain. He turns into purpose everything man calls loss. And that day I felt the story was complete but not closed. The sea continued roaring, calm and strong as if applauding. With my eyes closed, I knew there would be one more sign. The sun came at sunset. Thomas and I were on the porch watching the golden horizon. The sky seemed made of fire and peace at once. Suddenly, a seagull landed at the end of the pier with something caught on its foot. Thomas went to it and noticed it was a small chain, a tiny gold cross. He brought it to me and said, "Mother, this is Father's, isn't it?" I held the pendant and, heart racing, confirmed. It was the same one my husband wore every day. I stood there not understanding how it had reached us. The sea, the wind, time, everything seemed to conspire to return that symbol. "He is with us, son," I murmured, "and God just reminded us of that." Thomas nodded, moved. "You know, Mother, I think God's miracles have the sound of the waves. They come quietly, but when they touch, they change everything." I smiled. "That's right. The sea is only the messenger." We kept the cross in a small frame next to Father's photo. It became the symbol of our new beginning. Visitors to the shelter looked at it and said, "This house has something different." I always answered, "It does. It has the presence of someone who loved to the end." Faith, after all, does not end with death, it only changes address. That night we held a community dinner. Laughter mixed with soft music from the old radio. Henry toasted with a coffee mug and said, "Evelyn, you won, my friend. You won with faith, justice, and forgiveness." I laughed and replied, "No, Henry, God won who never gave up on us." The sea reflected the moon with an almost supernatural glow. I felt the wind touch my face like a caress. It was as if the sky said, "Now you can rest." And for the first time in a long time, I truly could. But destiny had one last mission for me, one I never expected. Days later, I received a call. A woman with a serene voice. "Mrs. Evelyn? This is the local radio. We heard about the shelter and your story. We would like you to tell everything live. It is a story of faith that needs to be heard." I smiled, surprised. "Of course, if it touches hearts, I will go." On the interview day, I wore a light blue dress, my husband's favorite, and went with Thomas. The small radio room looked simple, but the moment was grand. When the microphone turned on, I breathed deeply and said, "I am Evelyn Harper, and if you are listening now, I want to tell you something. What seems the end is often the beginning of the miracle." I told everything from the lemon cake to the cross the sea returned. Every word came with true emotion. The host wiped his eyes. I concluded, "If you are suffering, do not give up. God's justice may come disguised as loss, but it always arrives as restoration." After the interview, the radio received hundreds of messages. People who forgave, who returned home, who found faith again. Thomas showed me on his phone and said, "Mother, look what you caused." I smiled. I did not cause it, son. It was God using my pain to heal other hearts. We returned home at dusk. The shelter was full of laughter and the smell of fresh bread. The sound of the sea seemed sweeter and the wind warmer. I sat on the porch, looked at the sky and murmured, "Thank you, Lord, for turning shame into testimony and loss into miracle." Thomas came closer, put his hand over mine and said, "Mother, you became a beacon for many people." I smiled, looking at the horizon. "No, son, I only learned to let God shine in me." And if this story touched you, moved you, or reminded you of someone, subscribe to the channel now and turn on the bell so you do not miss the next one. Here, every week we share real stories of faith, courage, and hope.